All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, welcome back.
Today, we're looking at something I think a lot of you have probably heard about and probably even read. It's called a radical how for Canada.
Yeah, this is a juicy one.
It is a juicy one, and it's a really interesting document.
Yeah.
And kind of the premise of it is that um, it's not so much about changing what gets done in government, but changing how it's done.
Yeah, that's the big takeaway, right? Like the how is really important, and this document really digs into that.
Yeah, and they make the argument that a lot of these things that they're recommending are actually already in place and pretty standard in like
Hmm.
leading companies and governments around the world.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, right? Because it calls itself radical,
Right.
but a lot of these ideas are already being used and kind of proven to be effective elsewhere. So it's more about bringing those practices into the Canadian public service.
Right, and kind of showing how they can be applied in a Canadian context. And I guess they're even doing some of that with a case study in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, we'll get into that later for sure,
Yeah.
because that's a really interesting example of how these principles are being put into action.
Yeah, it's almost like they're giving us permission to be radical.
Right. It's like giving us permission to do what actually works.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, I mean, one of the things that the source mentions is that like
Yeah.
Canadian bureaucracies, I mean, maybe even just bureaucracies in general they're so risk averse.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's definitely a common perception. And, to some extent it's understandable, right?
Yeah.
We're dealing with public funds, we're dealing with important services that people rely on, so there's a natural tendency to be cautious.
Right. But I think, as we all know, that can sometimes also lead to stagnation.
Oh, for sure. It can definitely lead to a fear of trying new things, a fear of failure.
Yeah.
And that can prevent us from innovating and improving the way we deliver services.
Have you found that to be the case in your work?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've definitely encountered situations where, there's this sense of this is how we've always done it.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to break out of that mold, even when, there might be a better way.
Right. And so this document, Radical How, is trying to kind of push us out of that comfort zone a little bit.
Yeah, it's a call to action in a way, right? It's like,
Uh-huh.
okay, let's acknowledge that this risk aversion exists.
Yeah.
But let's also recognize that it's holding us back, and let's start exploring different ways of working.
So what is the solution according to a Radical How?
Yeah.
What do they want us to do?
Well, they propose a few key things. One is this idea of really shifting towards a mindset centered around outcomes, like I mentioned before.
Right.
It's not just about following processes, it's about asking what is the change we want to see in the world? What is the impact we want to have on people's lives?
I love that focus on outcomes.
Yeah, it's really crucial, and it ties into the other things they talk about, like building things in an iterative way.
So you try something out, you see if it works.
Exactly. You test it with users, you get feedback, and you constantly improve it based on what you learn.
So it's like less about the big grand plan and more about testing and
Yeah, it's about being agile, being responsive to change, and being willing to experiment.
agile.
And that ties into the third thing, which is this emphasis on multidisciplinary teams.
Right, which is what I wanted to dig into a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because, one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading this was just the list of services that are offered by public digital.
Yeah.
There's expertise there in like digital strategy, service design, cybersecurity, and even executive development.
It's a really broad range of expertise, and that's intentional, right? The idea is to have all these different perspectives, all these different skill sets working together.
And the source argues that that is like really crucial to the success of this.
Absolutely, because you can't solve complex problems in isolation, right? You need
Right.
people who understand the technology, the policy, the user needs the data, all of it.
So for instance, instead of having people who work in service design over here
Right.
and the tech people over here and the policy people over here,
It's all in one room.
it's all in one room working together from the start.
From the very beginning, collaborating and coming up with solutions that are holistic and actually meet people's needs.
I mean, that makes me think about, I don't know how many times I've gone to a government website
Right.
and I'm like, why is this so hard?
Why is this so complicated? Why can't I just do the thing I need to do?
Exactly. And maybe if those teams were working together more effectively from the beginning, it would just be a way better experience for the user.
Yeah, and I think a lot of listeners can probably relate to that experience, right? We've all been frustrated by government services that are clunky or difficult to use.
Yeah. I mean, for example, how we get healthcare information online now.
Yeah.
I mean, what if you had all those different people working on that
Right.
to make that an easier process?
Absolutely. I mean, imagine if you had service designers working with the healthcare professionals, working with the tech people to create a seamless user experience
Yeah,
where you can easily access your health records, book appointments, understand your treatment options.
that's what we want.
That's the kind of impact that multidisciplinary teams can have.
And I guess that kind of leads into the Nova Scotia case study,
Oh, yeah.
which is actually mentioned in the source.
Right, because it's a real-world example of how these principles can be applied in practice.
So what's happening in Nova Scotia?
Well, essentially, Public Digital is working with the Nova Scotian government to help them become more service-led.
Yep.
They're applying these ideas of user research, iterative development, multidisciplinary teams to improve the way government services are delivered.
What are some specific examples of things they're doing?
Well, for one, they're really focusing on involving citizens in the design
Oh,
process.
okay. So they're actually talking to the people who are using the services.
Yeah. Yeah, they're doing user research, they're getting feedback, they're understanding people's needs and pain points.
And then using that to shape the design of the services.
Exactly. And they're also working in a very iterative way.
Okay.
So they're not trying to build these massive perfect systems all at once.
Yeah.
They're starting small, testing things out, getting feedback, and then iterating based on what they learn.
It's like building a prototype. Right?
Yeah, exactly. It's about being experimental, being willing to fail fast and learn from those failures.
So it's a very different approach from the traditional waterfall method of like
Right.
plan everything out in detail and then just execute it.
Exactly. And the Nova Scotia case study is showing that this iterative, agile approach can actually work in government
And deliver real results for citizens,
and deliver real value for citizens.
which is what we're all about.
right.
Exactly. That's the whole point.
This reminds me of something that the source talked about, which is that, these ways of working.
Yeah. They're often cited as reasons for the success of major companies like Amazon or Google.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these companies are known for being data-driven, user-centric, and incredibly agile.
So it begs the question, like, if these methods work for them,
Yeah, why not for us?
why not for us in the public sector?
I mean, we're dealing with equally complex problems, if not more so.
Yeah.
And we have a responsibility to serve the public, to deliver value to citizens.
Right.
So why shouldn't we be using the best tools and practices available to us?
So really, this document is making the case that we should be learning from the private sector.
Absolutely. And not just the private sector, but also from other governments around the world who are already successfully using these approaches.
And that we don't have to be afraid to try new things.
Exactly.
I think, one of the things that's really powerful about this whole document is that it's not about,
Yeah.
some sort of massive disruptive overhaul of everything.
It's not about throwing everything out and starting from scratch.
It's about taking what works.
Right. It's about taking what works and adapting it to our context, to our needs.
And I think that's really important because, change can be scary.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in large organizations like government.
But this document is saying, hey, it doesn't have to be this big, scary thing.
Yeah.
We can do this in a way that's incremental, that's manageable.
And that's ultimately about serving citizens better.
So as we wrap up, I guess, I'd like to leave our listeners with a thought,
Yeah.
which is think about those principles that we talked about. Multidisciplinary teams, outcome focus,
Iterative development.
iterative development, testing things out.
Yeah.
How can you in your own work
Yeah.
apply those
How can you bring those principles to life in your own role?
to make a more meaningful difference?
Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right? It's about making a positive impact on people's lives.
Yeah. And, it might not be easy.
It's not always going to be easy.
There will be pushback. There will be resistance to change.
There will be challenges for sure.
But I think the potential impact is worth exploring
Absolutely. It's worth having those conversations. It's worth pushing those boundaries
and seeing how we can make government work better for everyone,
for everyone.
all along. So that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you in Canada.
And be sure to check out A Radical How for Canada.
Yeah, definitely give it a read. It's a really thought-provoking document. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.